Hello and welcome to this Tuesday's morning market briefing. We've got lots to talk about, but firstly, the EU and France do press Xi Jinping for a more balanced Chinese trade deal, as well as that Hamas accepts hostage for prisoner swap proposal. We've got lots to talk about in the charts also, with lots happening on the economic calendar, but we'll come to that near the end, so make sure you stay around so you can see that. Before we get straight into it though, make sure you subscribe. The first article to talk about is to do with the EU and France. Now, Emmanuel Macron and the head of the EU have now made a stern warning to the Chinese leader Xi Jinping that the EU needs to protect themselves from cheap imports. This comes in a new effort by the EU to rebalance trade ties, with the meeting also seeing the European leaders urging Xi to reduce his support for Russia's invasion into Ukraine. Now, of course, this is a very important article and kind of links into a few things that we've been talking about recently. Of course, we've been covering, we always cover topics relating to China and the Chinese economy greatly. Of course, that's very important, and it's obvious to why we do that, being such a large trading partner of so many nations, as well as just kind of being one of the many economic powerhouses of the world, and basically being that manufacturer for so many economies of the world. China is very important to always talk about, and of course China has been facing a great deal of their own economic issues recently. Of course, we know that property slowdown within the Chinese economy has greatly affected investor confidence, business confidence, consumer confidence, and really it's taken a toll on the Chinese economy as a whole. Really, China has struggled to kind of revive themselves coming out of the COVID lockdowns. Of course, we know that China was probably the strictest, if not one of the strictest, with their COVID policies, their COVID lockdown policies, and as a result of that, we know that stunted the economy greatly. And this is also coming at a time where economies around the world are seeing great levels of inflation, high interest rates, and therefore consumers have less money to go to the shops and buy stuff with. And so as a result, we're seeing consumers move away from their spending habits during this time, which of course is affecting the Chinese economy, which of course, as I've said at the start, is the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, especially with regards to consumer goods. So as a result of that, China's economy has been struggling greatly. As a result of that, we've seen the property slowdowns, we've seen the investor crisis, and this is also coming at a time, of course, where geopolitical tensions are kind of through the roof. We've of course got wars in Europe, the Middle East, and the threat of a Chinese invasion into Taiwan is kind of always hanging over the world. And the prospect of that is, of course, should China invade Taiwan, what's the possibility of a world war breaking out with the US and China going to war, and that pulling in their own respective allies. So all of this has also affected trade ties, which we know, of course, have worsened with the US introducing their own, export limits and bans to China, as well as their own import bans from China as well, to try and restrict the kind of information, consumer information, and technology information that's going to China, and also restricting China's ability to dump their goods on US markets. And that is kind of what we're seeing here from Macron and the EU's leader, where they're kind of going and they're telling Xi Jinping that basically we need to retalk our trade deals, our thoughts on trade, as ultimately this is not a favorable situation for us. And at the moment, we want to protect our own economy and consumers first, and then we can kind of talk about you benefiting as well. And that really is what seems to be happening here. We know, of course, that not only the USA have been having trade battles with China, but also the EU as well. And this is kind of more important, of course, to this article, which is talking about the EU and France, because we do know, of course, that recently China have launched their own anti-dumping probe into the French, designer cognac company, owned of course by Louis Vuitton, and that's created this kind of conflict once again, which seemingly here we're seeing the EU, France and China try and work on dealing with that. I think this is also a very interesting article with regards to geopolitics. Ultimately, often when we're talking about geopolitics, we're talking about it because the article is directly, hinting to something new within the geopolitical scene, new to do with military talks and that kind of thing. And we know that kind of the US especially has been trying to now repair those weakened tensions with, weakened ties, with China. We know that military officials between the US and China are now once again in contact with one another, which of course was halted after the at the time House Speaker Nancy Pelosi did visit Taiwan, and that's created its own issues. So here I think we should also think about geopolitics with regards to the fact that Xi really is meeting these key European leaders, and that tells you something about the current political landscape that maybe you weren't thinking. Personally, the kind of conflicts around the world is definitely pushing my mentality to, the world tensions are at their all-time highs. Xi Jinping's going to be hesitant to interact with these foreign leaders, such as those within the EU, like France. But here we are actually seeing these two leaders, Emmanuel Macron and Xi Jinping, come into going into discussions and making agreements on certain things. So I think that's also something to be said, with Macron thus far hailing the meeting as a sign of progress, with some advances in commercial related discussions being made. She has now joined in calls for the worldwide truce during this year's Olympics in Paris, of course. Now, the EU leader von der Leyen, pardon me for that pronunciation, warned China that their surplus production was creating market distortions in the EU market, and as a result the EU were investigating certain Chinese companies on the grounds of subsidy usage. The EU Commission President said that they want to defend their companies, their domestic companies and economy. The EU's key investigation thus far has been into the EV industry, with France especially looking to protect their own European manufacturers. In response, China have launched their own anti-dumping investigation into the high-end cognacs made by the French designer conglomerate LVMH. According to the Chinese officials, Xi is to visit Europe in an effort to limit damage from trade tensions, with Macron also thanking Xi for making a pledge to not sell weapons to Russia, of course. So a very interesting article here, which at the end, of course, links back to those comments around geopolitics, which of course I was talking about. So an interesting article nonetheless to cover, and something that's of course important to keep on your mind. Next article to talk about though is to do with Hamas and the hostage deal, which seemingly has now been accepted. Now, Hamas has now accepted the Israeli proposal to free dozens of Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. This comes in a move which will also establish a temporary ceasefire in the war. Now, of course, we've been covering this conflict extensively, and we know, of course, there's been a massive fallout across the world as a result of this conflict as well. And the key thing at the moment has been the expected offensive into Rafah by the IDF. That has kind of been the key thing that everyone's been talking about, of course, since Rafah is kind of the key strategic southernmost city of the Gaza Strip, which of course also is housing a great deal of humanitarian facilities, as well as most of the refugees from the war in Gaza. And we know, of course, that therefore an invasion into Rafah could have very dire consequences for the population there, the civilian population there. And that's kind of been the key worry for international organizations and governments around the world recently. And we've known that the likes of the Biden administration and other, traditional Israeli allies have been warning Israel against engaging in this operation. However, seemingly this kind of idea of going into Rafah and the operation into Rafah is kind of being used by Israel as a move against Hamas to actually negotiate over this kind of hostage deal, as it does seem like they're using this prospect of a Rafah invasion, which we know is the kind of last city within Gaza which is not occupied now by Israel. And the kind of thought is that Israel is pressuring Hamas into accepting this hostage deal, so that they then don't go into Rafah. So that is seemingly what is pushing now Hamas to accept this offer, as we'll start to talk about why they may have accepted it and what the actual proposal is. But obviously we also know, as this photo does show on this article, that there's been a great deal of domestic pressure against Netanyahu, of course, to essentially make sure a hostage deal takes place, as there's a large sector of the Israeli population, I'm not sure on how much, whether it's the majority now, but there's a great deal within Israel which are of course calling for a kind of ceasefire and a focus on a prisoner for hostage deal, as ultimately many families and many relatives of these hostages, which are still held in Gaza, want their family members home, they want their friends home, and as a result they're kind of angry at Netanyahu for using these hostages as bargaining chips, as we ultimately do know, or at least suspect, that a great deal of these hostages which are currently held by Hamas have actually already died within captivity, which of course means that these family members then won't be able to see those friends or family return home. So that's why a great deal of Israel's population is angry at Netanyahu and the more far right members of the coalition government, which of course are pushing for an invasion into Rafah, which will have dire consequences on the civilian population and also likely create a great deal of death for the IDF and also their own hostages, which are currently being held by Hamas. Now, the announcement coming from the announcement on the deal did come from Hamas's Telegram channel, which stated that the Doha-based leader of the group told the Qatari Prime Minister that it was a deal. That said, Hamas has still not announced the details of the deal that has been agreed upon, as well as that we still have not received a response from the Netanyahu government. Therefore, it's still unclear whether the conflict in Gaza will continue. This all obviously comes whilst Israel lays the groundwork for a military offensive into Rafah, which is currently considered as Hamas's last stronghold. With this also coming as Israel was reported to have carried out airstrikes into Rafah once again, and according to the FT's reports, or the Financial Times reports, the deal accepted by Hamas was largely similar to the one put forward a couple of weeks ago by Israel and its mediators, and of course we spoke about that when it came out, with the proposal also calling for a 6-week ceasefire and the release of 33 hostages. That's all to talk about in the articles, though. Some interesting ones that we've covered there and lots to think about, most certainly. Next to talk about, though, of course, is the charts, where we do have quite a bit happening to start off the week. That said, though, we are starting on the US 30 to talk about US indices as a whole, where, to be honest, not too much is happening. As you can see here, price last week was able to break above and out of this key area of liquidity, which price was stuck below for quite some time. So price was able to break above that last Friday, and since then price has slowly just moved to the upside, and that is really what did take place yesterday, with price just slowly moving to the upside to reach that minus 27.2% Fibonacci extension level. That said, price still hasn't reached that level, but still, over Monday, price was slowly creeping higher and should seemingly end off the day a little bit higher than where it started off at. So ultimately price is on the upswing, but very slowly, and should price make its way and reach this minus 27.2% Fibonacci extension level, it'll be interesting to see whether we then do see a sell-off, as you could argue that there is some liquidity, bearish liquidity around this level as well, just because we've seen a great deal of accumulation and distribution around that zone. So lots to think about on the US 30 as well. Next to talk about, though, is the dollar. which is an interesting position. Obviously, last week on Friday, we received the US's NFP figures, so the unemployment figures, which of course was very interesting to see, with that coming in below expectations, which is why we've seen this volatility on Friday. And that can be seen here with this large wick to the downside, breaking below this area of liquidity. But currently, price is still holding above this liquidity zone, which we had noted out previously as a strong area of resistance. Price has now made its way back down to that level, and the question is, of course, whether price will hold above this area of liquidity today, or in fact it will break fully to the downside, and then we'll be in a new area of the market, really. So that's the key thing to note. Should price stay above this liquidity zone, the next kind of upside liquidity area is, of course, this liquidity zone just up here, which has previously acted as a key support level and should then act as a key resistance level. So lots to think about on the dollar. Next to talk about is Euro USD. So still on the topic of the dollar, really, but talking about the euro now, where we have seen price wick to the upside on Friday and come into contact with this liquidity zone that we'd previously noted, and price is now currently just holding below this level. That's the moves that we did see on Monday. Price was very slow, not much happened, and price stayed below this key liquidity zone. It'll be interesting to see then, because price has kind of moved to the upside of that liquidity zone, where the price will now trend to the downside and come into contact with this lower level of liquidity. That'll be interesting to see. Should price interact with that, then we need to then think about whether price could move to the upside or break below it, but we'll see. We'll talk about that when it comes to it. But those are the kind of two key areas to note at the moment. There's no key fib levels, I don't think, to note. Maybe if we draw out this level, we could note 6180, but really it kind of has broken above that level, so I wouldn't say it's too significant of a level. And really, we're just waiting to see what is going to happen on Euro USD after we did receive a great deal of data last week with regards to both the euro and dollar. So I think it will just take some time for markets to really price in both of those news events, with the NFP figure and Fed interest rate decision last week affecting the dollar greatly, and then I believe we received a great deal of Eurozone data last week as well. So definitely keep your eyes on Euro USD. Next, talk about those pound yen, which has just been incredibly volatile recently and really has broken out of its trend or any kind of usual sense of kind of market structure. And at the moment, we're seemingly seeing this kind of short retracement to the upside back to this old area of resistance and old all-time high before price obviously rallied out of that level not too long ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. But yet, so price has now come into contact with that once again after kind of retracing, and it'll be interesting to see then whether price does sell off from this level. So keep your eyes on pound yen. Next talk about though is Bitcoin, which is still just holding at this $63,000 a Bitcoin level, and obviously this is also coming after this false breakout to the downside where price did break below that $60,000 Bitcoin level, and many were then starting to panic around whether the kind of bull run was over. But now price is once again back above that $60,000 level, so it'll be interesting to see how long price can stay up there, and if it is going to stay up there, whether price will then continue to swing to the upside. Next talk about though is gold, which is in an interesting position as well, as it is currently kind of sitting within this key liquidity zone and area of resistance. We know that back in the start of April, this area acts as a key area of liquidity, and then later in April an area of distribution and accumulation, and more recently it's acted as an area of resistance, and once again price has now moved into that level on the larger picture, on the higher time frames. Of course, we've noted that recently price has interacted with this key 50% Fibonacci retracement level, and price has moved in a bullish manner away from that. So it will be interesting to see whether, because of that bullish sentiment, price can break above this liquidity zone. So definitely keep your eyes on gold. Lastly to talk about though is of course oil. Not much to say on oil. Price is really stagnating and not much is happening, but keep your eyes on oil nonetheless, with the news from the Middle East of course greatly affecting world tensions, especially Middle East tensions, which plays into oil's price greatly. So keep your eyes on oil. Lastly to talk about of course is the economic calendar, where we're getting a great deal of data today, so I'll run through that quickly. Firstly, we're getting the British retail sales figure, followed by the Aussie interest rate decision and press conference. As well as that, we're getting the Swiss unemployment rate figure, as well as the German balance of trade figure and French balance of trade figure. Followed by that, we're getting the British construction figure, as well as the Eurozone retail sales figure, and also a Fed official's speech. So not too much kind of important data or news being released today, but still some importance, still some stuff to listen out for, which will be affecting the markets somewhat. That's all to talk about on the economic calendar, though. We've covered lots in the articles, lots in the charts, and lots in the economic calendar. Hope you have a great trading day, but that's all from us at Wildwood Capital. Have a great one. See you later. Bye.